They would whisper her name before the night was over, but Sophie Lane didn't know it yet. All she knew was the weight of silence pressing down as the glass walls of the Crescent Bay Yacht Club glimmered beneath the setting sun, trapping secrets, envy, and power within. What unfolded here tonight would change everything, not just for Sophie, but for everyone who thought they understood her place in this gilded world. If you believe no one deserves to be belittled for where they come from, if you've ever rooted for the quiet underdog who rises higher than anyone expects, make sure to like this story and subscribe for more moments where arrogance meets its reckoning, because Sophie's night was just beginning, and it would end in a way no one could have predicted. The club was alive with laughter and soft jazz drifting through the salt-kissed air, but Sophie stood just outside the threshold of the grand ballroom, her hand tightening around the delicate silver clutch she had borrowed from a friend weeks ago, knowing tonight's crowd would notice everything she wore, everything she said, and everything she wasn't. She had grown up far from places like this, a quiet, bookish girl raised in a modest coastal town where boats were used for fishing, not flaunting, where salt water lived in your skin and survival came from hard work, not family names engraved in marble. But her husband, Ethan Cross, belonged here, or rather, he owned rooms like this even before he technically owned anything at all. He was one of those rare, brilliant minds who'd built a tech empire from scratch before he turned 30, a man who made the world listen without ever needing to raise his voice. Sophie loved him deeply, but sometimes she wondered if the world they walked through together loved her back. Nights like this were proof that it didn't, not yet. Inside, chandeliers cast rivers of golden light over crystal tables set with imported roses, and the air carried the faint hum of money. Quiet, generational, confident. Men in linen suits gathered near the bar, trading stories of mergers and regattas, while women in shimmering designer gowns perched like jeweled birds on velvet chairs, watching, judging, cataloging. Sophie could feel the heat of their gazes before she even entered, and still, she drew in a steadying breath, lifted her chin, and walked inside, keeping her posture poised despite the uneven rhythm of her heart. Ethan had disappeared toward the board members moments earlier, his tall frame cutting through the crowd effortlessly, his name whispered in tones of admiration as hands reached for him. Deals hovered in the air, and reputations bent around his presence like tides around the moon. Sophie, meanwhile, moved more cautiously, her footsteps soft against the marble floor, trying to blend into the sea of sequins and champagne. But her quiet composure seemed to provoke rather than protect her. She heard the first whisper before she even reached the hors d'oeuvres. "She looks lost." Someone breathed just loudly enough to be overheard. A thin-lipped woman with diamonds heavy around her throat. Who invited her? This isn't exactly the public docks. The words pricked like needles beneath Sophie's skin, but she kept her expression smooth, focused on a distant painting she pretended to study. Another laugh joined in, lower and colder. "Oh, that's the Cross wife," another voice murmured, laced with deliberate venom. "Small-town nobody, right? The charity case he picked up when he got bored of models. Probably thinks port and starboard are cocktail names." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp, slicing into Sophie's confidence in a way that left her chest tight, her throat aching with the effort of restraint. She kept walking, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction, her fingertips grazing the cool edge of a champagne flute from a passing tray just to ground herself. But as she approached a cluster of tall windows overlooking the marina, a third voice, this one louder, careless, designed to be heard, delivered the final blow. "Don't worry about her," a tall blonde in a backless emerald gown said, her tone dripping mock sympathy. "These kinds of wives never last. Ethan will trade up eventually, probably for someone who actually belongs here." That word, belongs, lingered like a bruise. Sophie's breath caught, and for the first time all evening, her composure cracked. She turned toward the glass, pretending to admire the soft twilight spilling across the water, willing her face to stay calm even as humiliation flushed beneath her skin. Outside, the marina was still, rows of yachts gleaming under the fading sun, each one a silent monument to wealth, privilege, and the quiet hierarchy she would never naturally ascend. Her reflection in the glass looked strangely fragile, like she didn't quite exist in this world of opulence and inherited power, like she was still that girl from a modest house with peeling paint, who had worked summers at the Harbor Cafe and saved every dollar just to keep the lights on. But then she felt it, a shift in the air behind her, a presence she would always recognize even without turning. Ethan. He didn't speak immediately, but she saw his reflection beside hers, his sharp suit catching the last glow of sunlight, his expression unreadable but his jaw tight with quiet tension. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, but edged like glass. "I heard them." Sophie blinked, keeping her gaze fixed on the rippling water beyond the window. "I don't want to make a scene," she whispered, her voice softer than she intended, carrying the weight of years spent learning to keep her head down, to keep moving forward without confrontation. But Ethan's gaze didn't waver, his reflection rigid beside hers. "It's not a scene if it's the truth," he said, his tone carrying the restrained authority of someone used to moving mountains without raising his voice. "And the truth, Sophie, is they don't deserve you." She smiled faintly, almost wistfully, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter. People like them. They'll always see me as someone who doesn't belong." Ethan turned then, fully facing her, his presence commanding despite the murmur of conversation rising around them. "Then maybe," he said, voice quiet enough that only she could hear, "we need to remind them whose world they're standing in." There was something behind his eyes Sophie had seen only a handful of times before. That sharp, calculated focus Ethan reserved for hostile negotiations and billion-dollar deals. It wasn't anger, it was something colder, heavier, deliberate. Before she could respond, one of the yacht club directors approached him, gray-haired and polished, introducing himself with the bright, artificial warmth reserved for people whose names matter more than their presence. Ethan smiled politely, shook his hand, exchanged pleasantries, and within seconds, was pulled away into a knot of board members eager to secure his attention. Sophie remained by the window, her reflection steadying under the golden lights, trying to swallow the lingering sting of the whispers, unaware that the course of her life and the future of the entire Crescent Bay Yacht Club had already begun to shift with Ethan's silence. Because behind the polite nods and handshakes, Ethan's mind was no longer on mergers or algorithms or quarterly earnings. It was on something else entirely. A decision forming in the space between breath and heartbeat. A decision that would leave the entire ballroom speechless by the following week and leave every whisper choking on the taste of their own arrogance. The whispers from the gala hadn't faded by morning, but Ethan Cross wasn't the kind of man who wasted words on outrage. He acted. While Crescent Bay's elites sipped lattes and speculated about Sophie's place among them, Ethan sat in his private office overlooking the harbor, his expression unreadable as he made calls that would reshape the entire yacht club before anyone knew what was happening. This wasn't about pride or proving worth. It was about power, and Ethan wielded his like a surgeon, quiet and precise. By the afternoon, through a web of shell companies and silent negotiations, he had acquired every single yacht in Crescent Bay's prized fleet, 24 vessels worth over $180 million, along with full operational control of the marina itself. He didn't announce it. He didn't boast. He simply waited for the perfect stage. 3 days later, the club called an emergency members meeting, the ballroom buzzing with nervous speculation as Sophie and Ethan arrived hand in hand. The same women who mocked her fell silent, their carefully practiced smiles faltering as the board gathered up front, visibly unsettled. When Ethan stood, the room hushed instantly. "As of this morning," he said evenly, his voice carrying calm authority, "I am the sole owner of Crescent Bay's fleet and the docking rights to this marina." The words landed like a thunderclap, drawing gasps, murmurs, and a few pale faces from the crowd. He let the silence hang before continuing. "And with ownership comes change. Starting today, Crescent Bay will fund community sailing programs, youth regattas, and marine conservation. This club will no longer be a monument to exclusivity. It will have purpose." That declaration was enough to shake the room, but the tension cracked further when Lillian Hawthorne, the blonde in the emerald gown who had mocked Sophie that night, rose slowly, her voice dripping with mockery. "How inspiring," she said sweetly. "A charity marina run by a woman who, just last week, couldn't tell port from starboard." A ripple of faint laughter moved through the room. Sophie froze, heat crawling up her neck, but Ethan didn't even blink. You're right, he said coolly, his gaze fixed on Lillian. She didn't know then, but she will. His hand rested lightly on Sophie's shoulder as he added, his voice deliberate and unyielding, because as of this moment, Sophie Cross is the head of Crescent Bay's outreach initiatives. If anyone here has a problem reporting to her, he paused, letting his eyes sweep the room. The exit's right behind you. Silence. No one moved. No one dared. In that stillness, Sophie felt something shift deep inside her, not because Ethan defended her, but because he had placed her at the center of the empire that once mocked her existence. The same whispers that had once humiliated her were now replaced by stunned respect and something sharper. Because as her gaze met Lillian's cold, narrowed stare from across the room, Sophie understood with sudden clarity. This wasn't the end of the feud. It was the beginning. Ethan had won this battle, yes, but the war for Crescent Bay's power had only just begun. For a while, it seemed Crescent Bay had finally settled into Ethan's control, but beneath the polished smiles and polite applause, resentment simmered like an unseen current, and Sophie felt it, even if no one spoke of it. At the center of that quiet storm was Lillian Hawthorne, the woman in the emerald gown whose humiliation at the members' meeting had burned too deep to heal. On the surface, she was gracious, offering congratulations at public events and posing for photographs with a practiced smile. But Sophie began noticing strange disruptions, missing sponsor agreements, canceled community permits, and sudden whispers in the press questioning her leadership. She brushed them off at first, assuming it was incompetence somewhere down the line, until the night of the summer charity regatta, Sophie's biggest project yet. Hours before the event, panic broke. 4 of the largest Crescent Bay yachts had vanished overnight, signed out with falsified documents and stolen access codes. Without them, the regatta's races were crippled, sponsors threatened to withdraw, and within minutes, anonymous leaks hit the local media blaming Sophie for gross mismanagement. Ethan acted immediately. While Sophie held her composure for the cameras, Ethan's private tech team traced the sabotage back to a single source, Lillian's personal consultant, who had hacked Crescent Bay's systems and falsified documents under her orders. The next morning, at an emergency board session, Sophie sat beside Ethan as his lawyers unveiled the evidence. Encrypted messages, bank transfers, and forged approvals leading straight to Lillian. For the first time, her polished mask slipped. Her cool defiance cracked under the weight of undeniable proof. In less than an hour, the board voted to strip the Hawthorns of their marina stakes and revoke Lillian's membership entirely. But Ethan didn't stop there. Leveraging their debts, he acquired what remained of the Hawthorns' shares and redirected them into a multi-million-dollar endowment for Sophie's community sailing initiatives. Lillian left without a word, her silence louder than any threat she could deliver. From that day forward, Crescent Bay changed. Sophie stepped into her role with quiet strength, launching youth sailing programs, funding ocean conservation, and opening once exclusive docks to schools and local families. The same people who had mocked her now sought her approval, but Sophie carried her newfound respect with grace, never forgetting how quickly power can shift. On the evening of the regatta's rescheduled launch, standing at the bow of the flagship yacht, Sophie gazed across the marina, its rows of pristine white sails catching the last light of sunset. She thought back to the night she'd overheard their whispers, the humiliation she'd endured, and the promise Ethan had made by the window. Remind them whose world they're standing in. Now she understood. This wasn't just Ethan's victory anymore. It was hers. Crescent Bay was no longer theirs to weaponize, theirs to gatekeep, theirs to mock. It was hers to lead. And as the applause rose from the docks below, Sophie smiled softly, knowing one thing with unshakable certainty. They would never, ever whisper about her again.